Hello everyone, and welcome to my ABCs of Abysscraft video. In this video, we're going to be talking about the different archetypes that are in Abysscraft and their general playstyle and art design. So if you are new to Abysscraft or the game in general, I hope this is at least a good starting point for you to see what archetypes there are that you might be interested in. Also, as of recording this, it is October, and I do plan on releasing this on Halloween. So since Abysscraft is a pretty Halloween-themed kind of class, I just figured it'd be appropriate. So if you're watching this on Halloween, happy Halloween. So this video is going to cover the general theme and style of Abysscraft, the most common deck archetypes, the general good cards for any given deck, and the general playstyle of that deck. Keep in mind that while I do show you a lot of cards for each of the archetypes, there are probably at least a good handful that are still good that I don't mention, or at least just verbally mention, just because of time and whatnot. But if it is relevant, I do try to at least mention it in this video. So let's start off with the general themes of Abysscraft. We have Departed, which is an attribute that covers mainly zombies and the ghosts as well, but they tend to kind of turn into their own archetype, as I'll explain later. We have vampires and demons, yokai, beasts, machinas, which are basically androids or robots, and gorgons, which are basically the snake sisters. Do keep in mind that all of these are attributes within Abysscraft, but that doesn't necessarily mean each of them is a solid cohesive deck in themselves. Some of them have good bits and pieces, but together don't really make a really strong deck, while others might actually have a good, strong, cohesive deck. But these are just the general common attributes and themes of Abysscraft in general for their followers. There are several different playstyles of Abysscraft. The first one being, it's the one that is most easily able to resurrect followers, with the most common example here being Death's Breath. The class also lets you gain additional benefits by paying life at some point during your turn, and it's usually referenced by as the Sanguine keyword, which we'll get to shortly, but I have Moriana the Bejeweled here as an example. It's the only class that has a discarding playstyle with the silence packages. So for an example here, we have Silent Purge here, where for 4 you can destroy an enemy follower and randomly have the opponent discard a card. Keep in mind that most of the discarding is random, but there are a few cards that Abysscraft has that lets your opponent choose a card, and there's one older card from set 1 that you can actually look at your opponent's hand and choose to make them discard it. However, generally speaking, the cards that your opponents discard are usually random. It's also the only class that has 2 cards at the moment that set your opponent's life to a fixed amount. So, for example, I have Miltail the Lovers here, which destroys each other enemy follower on the field and sets the enemy's leader's defense to 6. While not exclusive to Abysscraft, it is the one that has the most common class with Bane in its followers' keywords, which is basically, if you're familiar with Magic the Gathering, it's the equivalent of Death Touch, where if your follower with Bane attacks an enemy follower, or an enemy follower attacks your follower with Bane, the enemy follower will just die either way, regardless if damage was even dealt. It will just happen after the battle. And lastly, maybe next to Forestcraft, it's also the next class that tends to board spam a lot of small token followers that usually cost 1 play point. So for an example, with Phantom Howl here, if you pay 3, you get 4 ghost tokens, which are 1 cost 1/1 ghosts that have Storm, but they die at the end of the turn. Alright, next up are the actual lists of different decks that are in Abysscraft, and so a lot of them are also still themed around the themes of what I mentioned in the original part of the video, with like Departed here and Gorgon, but you know, some of them, like for example Beast, it's not on here. I am going to go through each of these from top left going down and then top right going down. So we have Departed and Nephthys, which do kind of interwork with each other similarly, but their playstyles are different. We have Sanguine, Control, Ghost, Gorgon, Yokai, Machina, 2 cost, Vampire, Shadow Paladins, which is not technically Abysscraft, but almost all the cards used are Abysscraft, so I'm just including it in here, and Wasteland. So before I do talk about Departed and Nephthys, I want to talk about the overall keyword that kind of binds them to be kind of under the same umbrella, which is Necrocharge. It's a keyword that says when a certain effect activates, if you have X cards in your cemetery, you get an additional effect. So for example, if you have 10 or more cards in cemetery, Azazel costs 3 less to play, so you play 4 play points to play him. If you have Necrocharge 10 with Do Blame Duke and Dame, you can deal 4 damage when he evolves instead of the normal 2. And then with Demon Lord Ektar, when you summon him, his fanfare effect, if you have Necrocharge 10, which means means you have 10 cards in cemetery or more. You get to summon 2 Abysscraft followers that cost 2 play points or less in your cemetery and put them onto the field. And if you have a Necrocharge 20, they get +3/+3 instead of the +1/+1. I mentioned this because here you can kind of see the 2 boss monsters of the 2 decks I mentioned with Departed and Nephthys, where you have Demon Lord Ektar, as I just mentioned a second ago, who's kind of the top card for the Departed archetype, and then you have Nephthys, who literally is her archetype. And they're both Departed, and even though Nephthys doesn't show that she has any kind of like Necrocharge skill, a lot of the followers that you use with her will need Necrocharge 10 or 20 in order for most of their effects to really trigger and get the full benefit off of them. So let's start with the Departed archetype with Demon Lord Ektar. It's a 7-cost 5/6 that on Fanfare, if you have Necrocharge 10 or more, you can summon 2 Abysscraft followers that cost 2 or less from your cemetery and put them onto your field and give them +1/+1. However, if you have Necrocharge 20, they can get +3/+3 instead of the +1/+1. And as long as Ektar's on the field, all Abysscraft followers, which includes himself, do get rush. With this deck, usually early and mid game, you are trying to just control the board of your opponent, trying to hit you as much as possible, and also at the same time try to bury the top card of your deck until you get to either 10 or 20. Ideally, you want to get to 20, but at the very least, you want to get to 10. So then by turn 6, maybe 7 at worst case, you are able to just keep summoning Ektar over and over again to just keep having such large bodies with such large stats that it's hard for your opponent to get rid of them, and then you can just honestly hit real hard for face. Now, you might wonder why I am specifying this archetype as Departed specifically, because nothing in Ektar's text specifies that it has to be Departed followers that you use with Ektar. They just have to be Abysscraft followers. Prior to set 8, that was the case. It was very common for you to really only have a few Departed followers and everything else be just 2-cost or smaller followers that just were really good to resurrect back with Demon Lord Ektar. But as of set 8, we got a card called Tartarus the Tormentor, which is a 10-cost 7/7 that costs 5 less if you have 15 or more Departed cards in your cemetery. And he can pay 1 and you put him into your EX area to look at the top 2 cards of your deck and reveal a Departed card from among them and add it to your hand, and then you bury the other one. Once he's on the field, you can evolve him for 1, and on evolve, he becomes an 8/8, so really big body for only 5 play points. And on evolve, you get to summon a Departed follower from your cemetery, and so the top option is Demon Lord Ektar. With Tartarus, also, do keep in mind that he himself is not a Departed card, so if you ever run Tartarus, you're never going to have 100% Departed cards in your deck. The most you'll be able to do is 37 Departed and probably 3 non-Departed, because Tartarus is so good, you might as well just run all 3 copies. Also, keep in mind that Tartarus himself is not Departed, so when you use his act ability to check the top 2 cards of your deck for a Departed card, you'll never be able to grab him. So if you do have the unfortunate luck of finding the other 2 Tartaruses on top of each other, you will unfortunately just mill them. So here are some other good core or more recent cards that are really good for Departed. You have Skeleton Dreamer, which is a 2-cost 2/3 that if its attack or defense gets increased, it gets Storm. So it fits perfectly with Demon Lord Ektar, because Ektar is going to buff it by a 1/1 or 3/3. Death's Breath is a good alternate way to summon Demon Lord Ektar, because it can summon an 8-cost or less follower, and Demon Lord Ektar is a 7-cost. So if you are able to play Death's Breath on turn 6 to summon Demon Lord Ektar, you are kind of cheating it out a turn earlier than expected. We have Nicola Forbidden Strength and his Evo and his spell Forbidden Art, which they're all Departed attribute, and Nicola helps mill 2 cards, and Nicola himself with Forbidden Arts does deal a decent amount of damage on the field, with Forbidden Arts dealing either 4 or 6 damage, and Nicola being able to rush in as well. And they're all Departed. They are unfortunately not able to be resurrected by Demon Lord Ektar because he is a 3-cost, but he provides a good combination of mill and control, so usually he's kind of the exception. And also keep in mind that these 3 cards together, Nicola's base form, his evil form, and Forbidden Arts, is usually also considered and called the Forbidden Package a lot of the time. So if I ever reference the Forbidden Package, this is usually the 3 cards I'm talking about. The next 5 cards are all from set 11, and they are also a part of the Wasteland archetype, but they are also Departed as well, so they do kind of jump back and forth between which deck you want to play. Ice Shillandrig is a really powerful card. He's a 5-cost 5/5 that summons a Magitrain token that can be maneuvered to deal damage every turn to the opponent and also heal a little bit. I don't want to talk too much about the Magitrain that he summons right now, because that just gets into a whole other topic and conversation information, but his on-evolve does let you discard a card to select 2 followers from your cemetery and add them back to your hand, and the best 2 options, generally speaking, are probably going to be Demon Lord Ektar and Tartarus the Tormentor, because you get to replay Ektar and then also get to reuse Tartarus the Tormentor's on-evolve to summon Ektar again back from the cemetery. To top it all off as well, whenever he gets engaged, which is either when he goes to attack or you can maneuver the Magic Train with Ice Shilindre, your opponent has to discard a card. So just a lot of value for 1 card. His spell, Dead to Rights, is also departed and is just a nice early game control card that just gives an enemy follower -2/-2. And then lastly is Ilgano, Horror Stray, and Great Pit Corpse. And while there's also other departed Wasteland followers that are good, I'm trying to keep this limited to a certain amount. So with Ilgano, when you summon her, if you have Necrocharge 10, you can banish her and summon a 3-cost or less Wasteland follower, which is either Great Pit Corpse or honestly the better option is the Wretch, but I don't have space here to kind of talk about them and get into all that conversation. Ilgano's last words is you put her back into your EX area and you bury the top card of your deck. So she effectively never truly dies unless she gets banished or returned to the bottom of the deck or returned to the top of your deck or returned back to your hand. And the Great Pit Corpse is nice because on summon, you can pop a card on your field to deal 4 damage to an enemy follower, and Ilgano is a great choice because then she just goes to the cemetery, which means then she's put back into the EX area and you bury the top card of your deck. There is also one other card that works really well with Ilgano, and that's a card called Soul Conversion, which is also a departed attribute card, and Soul Conversion, basically for 1 play point, you get to destroy a follower on your field to draw 2, so it works really well with Ilgano because when she dies, she goes to your EX area, and then you draw 2, and then you mill the top card of your deck with Ilgano's last words effect. At the end of the day, this is a very recursive heavy deck between Death's Breath to bring back Demon Lord Ektar, Ice Shilindre being able to grab back Ektar and Tartarus the Tormentor, and then Ilgano with Great Pit Corpse and Soul Conversion. So there's a lot of returning value with this deck, but it is slow in the early game, so it's kind of like I like to describe it as like a diesel engine where it's slow at first, but as the game progresses, it picks up and kind of gets out of control and hard to deal with. Alright, next up is the other half of the Necrocharge playstyle, which is Nephthys. She's a 7-cost 5/5 that on summon, you look at the top 7 cards of your deck and you may summon up to 4 Abysscraft followers with different names that cost 6 or less from among them, and then put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order, and then you destroy all the followers you just summoned this way. So upon reading this, you might think that this card is not that great. I mean, you're paying 7 for a 5/5 that does literally nothing else other than summon up to 4 other Abysscraft followers that will just instantly die upon being summoned. But do keep in mind that because they were summoned, all their fanfare and last word abilities do trigger from being summoned and then dying, and there's a lot of good fanfare and last word abilities that can trigger with Nephthys for 0 cost other than just summoning Nephthys. Also keep in mind that Nephthys does contribute to your Necrocharge count because those up to 4 cards that you do summon and kill do contribute toward your Necrocharge count, and a lot of cards also upon fanfare just help mill more cards to your cemetery, which we'll get to soon. And so a lot of the idea is you play cards have really good high cost Necrocharge counts, and those high cost counts help contribute to finish the game off. So here are some additional cards to help give better context. Again, you have Death's Breath where you can resurrect back Nephthys for only 6 instead of paying her 7 cost, and then she also gets the additional benefit of getting Ward. You have Anea Amethyst Rebel, which synergizes really well with Nicola and his Forbidden package, and she also heals 2 on her last words. Number 6, Milteo the Lovers, is a great card to hit with Nephthys, and his Evo is one of the late game ways you can try to finish the game. His base form has a fanfare ability that says you can discard a card, reveal cards from the top of your deck until you reveal 2 followers that cost 3 or less and summon them, and then you shuffle the cards that you revealed and put them to the bottom of your deck. And then if you have Necrocharge 20, you can evolve him, and his on-evolve says you can pay 2 more play points to destroy each enemy follower on the field and change each enemy's leader's defense to 6. So naturally, with the fanfare effect, one of the best cards you can choose from checking the top card of your deck is Nicola, because he's a 3 cost. And when he's summoned, you also get to bury 2 more cards from his fanfare. And then you can also pay 1 more if you have a play point or an evo point to evolve him, to grab back Forbidden Arts from your cemetery and use Forbidden Arts to help control the board more. Also, Milteo the Lover's evolve does not count towards the once per turn evolve because it doesn't have the little gold E. So you can easily play Milteo, get Nicola, mill 2 more with Nicola, and maybe hit Necrocharge 20. And if you do hit Necrocharge 20 with Nicola, you can, at the end of the turn, evolve Milteo and then pay 2 to destroy every other enemy follower on the field and set your leader's defense to 6. So you could actually potentially evolve twice in a turn. Up next is Whispers of a Dream, which is a 2-cost quick spell that says you can destroy a 3-cost or less enemy follower on the field and bury the top card of your deck, so that helps with the Necrocharge count. And then you also have Do Blame, Duke, and Dame, which granted, he's a 2-cost follower, but in my mind, he's kind of like a 3-cost as well, just because of how good his evolve is, and the fact that he also buries a card, so he helps towards an Necrocharge count. And his on-evolve says you can select an enemy follower on the field and deal it 2 damage, but if you have Necrocharge 10, you can deal 4 damage instead. Other cards to note that I just haven't had space to show are things like Arion, Yuzuki, Righteous Demon, and Blaster Dark and his Evo. They all work really well with Necrocharge. And one of the bigger followers that is meant to kind of be the finisher for the deck as well is Odile Black Swan, because she's a 5-cost 6/4 that on summon you get to deal 2 damage to each enemy leader and the enemy followers. And then it has, if you have Necrocharge 20, it has Storm, and then on strike it also deals 2 to your enemy's board and 2 to themselves as well, so it can potentially deal up to 10 total damage to your enemy leader in 1 turn. I also haven't even mentioned how Ice Shillandrig from the last Necrocharge section with Ektar is also just really solid in this deck, because with his Evo, you can just grab back 2 big followers to swing with the Magitrain, which I still haven't gotten into, but I will in the Wasteland section. So if you're curious about the Magitrain, go to that section. But long story short, Ice Shillandrig also works really well in Nephthys. All right, so the next major archetype doesn't actually split off, thankfully, but it is the Sanguine archetype, which is based off of the Sanguine keyword, which basically says Sanguine is active if your leader's defense has decreased during your turn, and that's either if you take damage or if you just reduce your life yourself. So for example, you could play Disciple of Lust, which on summon deals 1 damage to each leader, which includes yourself, and then you could play some card like Kiss of Lust, which would give you 2 life, and then you draw a card, but if Sanguine is active for you, you get to draw an additional card, and Grudge Teller, which normally would only deal 1 damage to each enemy leader, but if Sanguine's active for you, deals 3 damage instead. With the Sanguine keyword, it does technically trigger on your opponent's turn when you take damage. However, most, if not basically all the Sanguine-based cards are all around when you take damage during your turn. Not specifically, but that's just the only time of opportunity that you get to play them. And unlike the Necrocharge-based decks, where they kind of have like a big boss that kind of gives you the framework of what the deck is for, there is no real solid boss card in Sanguine. There is just a bunch of really good or really bad Sanguine cards that you just kind of can put together to make a deck around. Here are some card examples where the top row are things that would trigger Sanguine, and the cards down below are things that would benefit off of Sanguine being active. So you have like Disciple of Lust again, where you can take a damage along with your opponent. Ambling Wraith has the same thing, but it just doesn't have the on-strike effect of doing the same thing. Wings of Lust lets you choose a couple abilities out of 3, but each of them also pings you for damage. You have Silverbolt Hunter, which is also a kind of Ambling Wraith or Disciple of Lust, but comparatively it is not as good. And then you have the things that benefit off of Sanguine, like Demonium Clash Devil, Valneric, Omen of Lust, Grudge Teller, Aragavi the Berserker, and Hazan Demon Blade Knight and his Evo. Out of all of these, I would say the bigger, better activator cards are Demonium Clash Devil, Aragavi the Berserker, and Hazan Demon Blade Knight. Sanguine is usually never a top tier deck, but it does always consistently get some support to keep it alive and active. So if you do decide to invest into Sanguine, you will consistently get cards that work well, and they're usually not very expensive either. All right, next up is the Control archetype, which is a little bit of a nebulous archetype that is more based around what the most recent destruction and control cards are. A lot of times it is based around Israfil here, which is an 8-cost 8/8 that on Fanfare you get 4 life, and on strike it deals 3 damage to each enemy follower on the field. However, it does evolve for 1, and its strike changes to deal 5 damage instead to each enemy follower. This being said, though, that doesn't necessarily mean she's always in the deck. Control really is based around whatever the current meta is and the best way to be the opposite of the meta and be anti-meta, but not to the point where it's kind of doing its own thing. It's more just kind of trying to control what is good, so you get to eventually burn them out, and then late game you can usually do something like Israfil, or you just get more leeway because your opponent's just out-resourced to finish the game. For new players, this might be the hardest deck to kind of wrap your head around, because unlike other archetypes that kind of have either a keyword or an attribute that kind of binds them together to make it easier, this is more really just you have to know how the cards play and just what is good against those cards. So, but a lot of cards are very common across the sets. So, for example, things like Whispers of a Dream or Thundering Roar or Do Blame Duke and Dame in the bottom right, they're all usually generally good throughout all the different sets, but a lot of times the top ends are what change. Usually you might use things like Yuzuki Righteous Demon or Ginsetsu Great Fox and her Evo, or even use Underworld Watchman Kawi for a little bit of control, and you can use Death's Breath to bring back these bigger followers, which includes Israfil because that's an 8 cost or less. The control archetype is also where the silent cards come in, which is the playstyle of discarding your opponent's cards randomly with things like Silent Purge. That usually tends to go under the control archetype aspect, because if you can make your opponent basically have little to no cards in hand, you're controlling them and therefore being able to just do your own thing and just finish the game. I do apologize if this explanation of control does feel a little nebulous with no real boss monsters or certain archetype where you can just kind of filter through the cards. This one you really just kind of have to know what cards do and what is in Abysscraft, and just the best way that Abysscraft cards can control other decks. As a complete stark opposite to control, Ghost is actually a pretty well-defined class, and it's really easy to tell what cards are generally speaking good for Ghost. The main card of the set is Masquerade Ghost. He's a 4-cost 4/4 that says whenever a ghost is put onto your field, give it +1 attack, and he evolves for 1, and he still retains the +1 attack for ghost tokens, but he also says that when he has last words and sent to the cemetery, you just put him back into your EX area, and whenever a ghost leaves the field, you get to summon a Gargantuan Ghost token instead. The main playstyle of this deck is early game you're meant to try to draw cards to eventually find Sincere Soul, while also getting cards with the word ghost into your EX area, which can also mean tokens or cards that just literally have the letters GHOST in their name into the EX area. On turn 5, you want to play Sincere Soul if you're going first, or 4 if you're going second, because you have the Evo point to evolve Masquerade Ghost. And in the late game, you eventually just want to keep summoning ghosts that get buffed up damage because of Masquerade Ghost and a few other cards to deal a good amount of damage to the opponent. And then with Masquerade Ghosts, the effect where when ghosts leave the field, you summon Gargantuan Ghosts, you use the Gargantuan Ghost to help defend yourself from your opponent. So what are these ghosts and Gargantuan Ghost tokens that I keep talking about? Well, the Ghost token is a 1-cost 1/1 follower that has Storm, so it can just attack your opponent directly when it's summoned. It has no summoning sickness. However, at the end of the turn, you do banish it from the field. And then the Gargantuan Ghost is a 1-cost 3/3, so pretty well statted, and it has ward for defense. However, at the start of your own main phase, you banish it from the field. So once your turn starts, you draw a card, and then once you hit the main phase, they disappear. And so your board opens back up for you to summon more ghosts back onto your board. So during that discussion, you might have noticed I mentioned a card called Sincere Soul without even really going into detail as far as what it is, and that's what I'll do here. So Sincere Soul is a 4-cost spell that lets you search your deck for a Masquerade Ghost, summon it, and then shuffle your deck, and then you give Masquerade Ghost ward, and then you can pay 4 play points and banish Sincere Soul from the cemetery. And if there's a Masquerade Ghost in your EX area, which by the time you get to this point, you should have your Masquerade Ghost have died on the board and gone back to your EX area because of its evolve last words, you get to summon a Sincere Masquerade Ghost from your evolve deck onto the board. Despite Sincere Masquerade Ghost coming from the evolve deck, he is not actually an evolved follower. He is what's called an advanced follower, which is a little different than an evolved follower, but for the time being and for simplicity's sake, you can kind of think of them as basically the same thing. Sincere Masquerade Ghost does have Storm, so immediately upon summoning him, you can just Storm for 5 damage. He does on summon 2 more Gargantuan Ghost tokens, and whenever a follower with a ghost in his name is put onto your field, they get +1 in rush. When Sincere Masquerade Ghost does go to the cemetery, you do get to put your Masquerade Ghost that's in your EX area and put it back onto the field engaged. This is meant to kind of represent like Masquerade Ghost taking so much damage in his Sincere form that he kind of downgrades back to his base form. Also, do keep in mind that Sincere Masquerade Ghosts floating effect of giving ghost followers +1 in rush just looks for the letters GHOST in the name. So obviously that works with the ghost tokens, but any other card like Ghost Maid here or Ghost Rider or Bakker's Peppy Ghosty also have just the letters GHOST in their names. So they also do get the +1 in rush if you do summon them after Sincere Masquerade Ghost. The Ghost archetype also has a few cards that get additional benefits if there are cards with the word ghost in the EX area. So for an example, Spirit Curator, you can use its second effect of checking top 3 cards of your deck to reveal an Abysscraft card if you have a ghost in your EX area. And Colossal Grudge normally costs 4. However, if you have a card with the word ghost in the EX area, it becomes 3 less to play. So it's basically a 1 cost that can deal 4 damage to an enemy follower and then 2 to its leader. All right, so the next archetype we're going to be talking about is the Gorgon archetype, although I almost consider more just a package and not really a standalone archetype just because there's not a lot of cards in it, and even then the cards that are in it are really just kind of mediocre at best. The overall point of the archetype is to summon serpent tokens that might be annoying to deal with because they can just run into enemy followers and just insta-kill them, but they're usually used as almost like a kind of resource to be able to do other effects. The easiest example of this being Venomfang Medusa on the screen's effect, where you can put 2 serpents from the field into the cemetery and destroy an enemy follower. So here are some of the best cards that you can run with Gorgons. You got the Serpent token, which is just a 1 cost 0/1 that has Bane. That's what all the Gorgons generate. Then you have Stheno and her Evo and Uriel and Trial of the Gorgons. And right now, as of set 11, this is literally all the Gorgon cards. So that's why I kind of consider it more of a package and not like a real deck archetype. However, that being said, there is still a decent amount of cards that work well with the Gorgon cards and the Serpent tokens. You know, Great Pit Corpse, Last Daylight, Soul Conversion, and Wardrobe Raider. And in set 12/13, there will be a new Medusa. I believe it's called Evil Eye Medusa. And there is a new spell as well called Viper Lash. So it will get a little bit more support, but it's still not enough to really make a strong, cohesive deck around. So if Gorgons were a package of cards that is almost a deck, Yokai has just enough cards that I can consider them a deck archetype. They revolve around Ginsetsu Great Fox here and her Evo, and she generates Fox tokens, which are also Yokai attribute token cards. And all the other Yokai cards work fine on their own. However, they really excel once Ginsetsu gets onto the board. This is mainly due to Ginsetsu's passive abilities just synergizing really well with all the other lower cost Yokai followers. Because as long as Ginsetsu's on the field, all the Yokai followers you play cost 2 less, and whenever they would deal damage, they deal that much +1, and then whenever they do leave the field, Ginsetsu does get +1 attack. And that's not even mentioning the fact that Ginsetsu synergizes well with herself, because if you do want to play another Ginsetsu, she costs 2 less, and she does get +1 more attack from the other Ginsetsu, and her damage does +1 more, and everything just kind of stacks with her. So then all the Yokai followers also, if you have 2 Ginsetsus on the board, cost 4 less, and they all get, you know, +2 attack, power, and you know, they just keep stacking, so it kind of get exponentially out of control if you do get 2 on the board. One downside to this deck though is if you do go through all 3 Ginsetsu Evos, your deck just kind of starts to run out of steam, and the only way to kind of finish the game is to use Shutendoji, which I'll show in a couple seconds, but even then it's just kind of just an okay card to try to finish the game. Here are the other Yokai cards. We got the One-Tail Fox token that just gets generated from Ginsetsu, and then Demonic Procession, Kasha, Zashiki Warashi and her Evo, Shutendoji and his Evo, and then you have a couple other cards that aren't Yokai but synergize pretty well with the deck, like Death's Breath and Chat Ringside Announcer and her Evo. Chat Ringside Announcer might be a weird card because it searches for an arena card, but Ginsetsu has the arena attribute, which if you go back to the first slide for Yokai and you look at Ginsetsu, you'll notice she has the arena attribute. And so Chat's a nice turn for, tutor for Ginsetsu in case you aren't able to find her. In my latest deck build, I have Chat as a 2-of in the deck with 1 Evo because you really just need to get her once. And then cards like Kasha or Death's Breath can usually bring her back multiple times, and by that point in the game too, you should be able to draw into a second Ginsetsu to try to get her onto the board a second time to, again, try to get that exponential amount of payoff with 2 of them on the board. In the future, Yokais do get more support in set 15 with a couple new cards, so they do get a little bit more continuous support, and the new cards are pretty good, so if you want to pick this deck up, you will get some more support in the future, and it did get a few, toppings. It's not the best deck in that format, but it is at least a solid, cohesive, good deck. All right, up next is Machina. It revolves around Mono Garnet Rebel here, which is a 2-cost 3/2 follower. Evolves into a 5/4, but it can only evolve if you have 4 other Machina followers on the field, and then you can pay 1 to finally evolve her. When she does evolve, you can banish an Alpha Drive from your cemetery and pay 2 play points to give all Machina followers, including herself, +2/+2 and Rush. So everything in Machina is very centric around Machina cards. There's rarely a chance to add other non-Machina cards to a deck unless it's just very generic support, and the deck is based around also recycling Machina cards from the cemetery, which basically means you're just banishing them to get additional effects. The easiest example being Mono's act ability on her base form, where you can banish 2 Machina cards to summon an assembly droid. The deck is also very spam heavy, with you being able to summon multiple assembly droids pretty easily and pretty cheaply to also easily get to the 5 Machina followers on the board because the assembly droid tokens are Machina attributed. Some cards in the archetype can also create a card called Repair Mode, which is a 1-cost spell that at quick speed lets you heal 1. It's not meant to purposefully be used in this deck, but because a lot of cards are kind of used between Abysscraft and Runecraft, because there are neutral Machina cards, sometimes you'll generate a repair mode, but for this deck it really does nothing other than just heal you 1 and sometimes take up way too much space in your EX area. So here are some of the most commonly used Machina cards that are probably best long-term to get. You have the Alpha Drive, which is used to boost up Mono and all the other Machina cards when Mono's in her evolved form, and then you have the Forbidden package with Nicola and his Evo and Forbidden Arts, and Anea, which can search out Nicola because she searches for a 3-cost or lower Machina follower. Down in the bottom left, I have the Assembly Droid token. As you can see, it's just a 1-cost 1/1 that has a relatively mediocre ability where you can tap it and bury 3 Machina followers, which can include itself, to select an enemy follower on the field and deal it 5 damage. It's rarely used for this effect, but sometimes you will just come across an enemy follower that is just really big and tough to deal with, and it's just really the easiest and only way to deal with a 5 defense or lower follower. And to finish everything else off, we have Bone Drone, Sanguine Core for some consistency, Techno Lord, and Mecha Gun Wielder. I do just want to point out for a second that Mecha Gun Wielder lets you put an Assembly Droid or Repair Mode token into your EX area, and for this deck you're 99% of the time, unless you are almost dead and you know that 1 life can save you, you will be summoning the Assembly Droid to your EX area and not doing the Repair Mode. That, like I said, that's not the goal of this deck, but Mecha Gun Wielder is used for Rune Machina as well, so that's why it gives you that option. The next archetype to talk about is 2 costs, which revolves around Crimson Rose Queen here and her Evo. She's a 6-cost 4/4 that on Fanfare you get a Thornburst token in your EX area, and then she evolves for 2, and on evolve you reveal your hand and you recover play points equal to the number of 2-cost cards revealed this way. And then whenever you play a card that originally costs 2, you can choose one of the following. You can either deal 2 damage to each enemy leader on the field and heal yourself 2, or you can just deal 2 damage to the enemy leader. Do keep in mind that Crimson Rose Queen's effects on her Evo is not once per turn, so if you have about 4 play points where you can play 2 different 2-cost spells, then you can trigger this effect 2 times, once each time you play a card. The 2-cost cards also are not limited to just Abysscraft, so keep neutral cards in mind that cost 2 as well while you're trying to deck build. Here are some examples of some 2-cost cards that work pretty well with Crimson Rose Queen. You have this small Moon and Sun package with a Matarasu, Tsukuyomi, and the Moon and Sun spell. And then you have really good cards like Whispers of a Dream, that is just really good in general, and Vuela, One-Winged Demon, which is specifically for 2-cost and is kind of a good 2-cost card that also has a 1 play point act ability, so you can play it during an odd number turn. One strange thing with the 2-cost deck is on odd turns, you tend to have 1 floating play point because all your cards are mainly even. So you're going to have that odd 1 play point floating. So Vuela is good for that. And then also because of the 1 play point, you have Dead to Rights right below Vuela, and which also kind of means you can run Ice Shillendrake in the deck. You don't have to, but he's just a really good card in general that synergizes with Crimson Rose Queen well, because you can evolve Crimson Rose Queen, recover some play points, and then if you have an odd number of play points with Crimson Rose Queen, you could always pay 1 and tap Crimson Rose Queen to maneuver the magic train that Ice Shillendrake makes. But if you get an even number of 2-cost cards in your hand for Crimson Rose Queen's Evo, then you don't necessarily have to maneuver the train, but you know, it's kind of situational, more up to you. And the last thing I just want to point out is the kind of Lust package that works well in the deck with Zealot of Lust and Kiss of Lust. Zealot of Lust is a 2-cost, so when you play her, you could burn the field for 2 and heal 2 with Crimson Rose Queen, and then if there are a few lingering followers that have like 1 play point, you could pay 1 and deal them 1 damage to finish them off, which does trigger Sanguine, and then you can play Kiss of Lust to not only heal 2 and draw 2, but then Crimson Rose Queen can trigger again, so you can deal 2 to the board and heal 2, or probably at this point, you probably would be able to just start burning your opponent for 2. There are a ton of 2-cost cards, so on the official Cygames website where you can filter through all the cards, just set the filters to 2-cost and neutral and abyss, and just, you know, go through them and just have fun trying to see what works well and what doesn't. I think at the very least, Zealot of Lust and Kiss of Lust are real solid, along with Whispers and Vuela. The Sun and Moon package in the upper left might be a little out of date, but it at least synergizes well, so I just wanted to at least point it out there as a decent package for the deck. The next archetype is the Vampire archetype. It's based around summoning 4 spat tokens, which are 1-cost 1/1s with no additional effect. And even though they have no additional effects, they are usually sacrificed to get more powerful effects off of them, with one example here being Vanya, Vampire Princess. Vanya is also the main face of the Vampire archetype, with a lot of the good cards being her. And there's even one card that specifies it wants to look for Vanya for one of its additional effects, so she's really good. And if you're building vampires, you really just have to have the copies of Vanya in the deck, or else you're just not playing vampires at the best it can be. So I'm starting with the 4 spat in the upper left. It's just a 1-cost 1/1 with no additional effects. However, you'll notice with a lot of these other cards, they do revolve around the 4 spat either being on the board or getting additional effects by sacrificing them. So we have Vanya, Nightshade Vampire, which again is another version of Vanya from the previous slide. She's a 3-cost 3/3 that can evolve into one of 2 cards. On the first form, whenever you play a 4 spat, you get to gain 1 life, and then on the second form, the Blood Queen form, whenever you play 4 spat, you can deal 3 damage to an enemy follower on the field. Then you have Gift for Bloodkin, which is the one card I was mentioning that looks for Vanya specified named cards exactly, where if you do have a Vanya in the cemetery, you get to draw a card after you play Gift for Bloodkin. Then you have Old Blood King, which is a great way to clear boards because he summons a couple 4 spat tokens, and on evolve gives those 4 spats +1 attack, and he, as long as he's on the board, they get rush and assail as well. So a really good way to kind of clean up boards. Then you have Raven, Eventide, and Noontide vampires, which the Noontide one lets you gain 1 life once per turn whenever a 4 spat is put onto the field. And Eventide, where you can tap her, sacrifice a 4 spat, and then deal either 4 damage to an enemy follower and draw a card, or heal 2, deal 2 damage to your enemy leader, and then draw a card as well. So either way, you're drawing a card, and 4 damage is being applied somewhere, or you're healing 2 and dealing 2 to the opponent. So real solid card, and if this card has ever stayed on the board for a long period of time, it starts to get out of control with how much advantage you get. And the last card I wanted to mention for the deck is Unleash Unleash the Nightmare, which costs 1 less to play if you have a vampire card on the field, so it can be a 3 cost instead of a 4 cost, and everything including forest bats are vampire attributed, so keep that in mind. And you get to summon 3 forest bat tokens with Unleash the Nightmare and then draw 2 cards, so good way to just board spam and generate some more advantage. Vampires in general do get good support for the coming sets, so if you are looking for a deck that does get continuous support, this is definitely a deck to look into. One downside though is it does tend to be a little bit more of an expensive card, because the Vanya cards tend to be a little more expensive between it being a fan favorite character and they are just printed at a higher rarity, so just keep that in mind. But you know, you do get to play a pretty solid deck that just continuously gets good support. Next is a deck that is not technically Abysscraft, it's actually a Vanguard archetype deck. However, the deck runs about 95% Abysscraft cards, so I am throwing it in here as like an honorary mention that if you do want to try this deck, that you certainly could. You do have to run a Vanguard leader, the Rensuzu Gamori leader. There is 2 versions. One should be pretty cheap and it is just named Rensuzu Gamori, and there is a more expensive version but still looks pretty, called Rensuzu Gamori the Dark Dictator. So if you're looking for a budget, you can just go with the Rensuzu Gamori one. If you kind of want to bling out your deck a little bit, you can go for the Dark Dictator version. The top end card for the Shadow Paladin deck is Phantom Blaster Overlord here, although he, in my opinion, is not the greatest top end card ever made. He is a decent card and he's kind of more of the defensive side of the deck. And the deck in general revolves around just having between 10 to 15 Shadow Paladins in the cemetery. So there's going to be a lot of milling, some discarding, but also you get to grab cards back from the deck. And so you do have to kind of keep an eye on your deck and making sure it doesn't deck out. But I wanted to add this to the list of archetypes because it is cemetery based, which is, you know, very similar to Necrocharge. It's going to be checking for the number of Shadow Paladins in the cemetery for a lot of the effects. One thing I do want to mention is I don't see any support for the deck in the foreseeable future, so it's not going to get consistent support, but I know old crossover sets have gotten more support in the future from their original set release, so it's something that you could certainly pick up now, and then it's almost guaranteed to get more support in the future when they do decide to do more Vanguard support. So the cards should be pretty cheap right now, and then at least you'd be ready for the new support that will come in the eventual future. Here are some of the core cards for Shadow Paladins. You got Full Bow as the starting amulet for the deck, which is different than every other Shadowverse deck where you actually start with an amulet on the board that has like an additional effect you can usually trigger pretty easily. Then you have Blaster Dark and his Evo, and then Phantom Blaster Dragon and his Evo, and Phantom Blaster Dragon gets a benefit by sacrificing Blaster Dark when summoning Phantom Blaster Dragon. The last thing I wanted to talk about in the deck were the 4 triggers. Many cards in the Vanguard archetype in general have a keyword called Single Drive. You can see it on Blaster Dark and Twin Drive on Phantom Blaster Dragon above. What it means is when the card attacks, you get to look at the top card of your deck if it's Single Drive, or the top 2 cards of your deck if it's Twin Drive, and if it has a icon in the upper right like Grim Reaper, Abyss Healer, Abyss Freezer, and Darkside Trumpeter have, you have the ability to trigger the additional effect down below. If the card doesn't have the icon in the upper right, or you don't want to activate the effect of the card with the trigger, then the card goes to the bottom of the deck. But if you do activate the card's trigger in the upper right, then the card goes to the cemetery. So for example, if you drive check and you get Grim Reaper, you can give a follower on your field +2 attack. If you drive check and hit Abyss Healer, you can heal 3. If you drive check and hit Abyss Freezer, you get to draw a card, and if you hit Darkside Trumpeter, then you can restand one of your followers, but it cannot attack the enemy leader this turn, but it can still attack enemy followers. And of course, you want to hit your triggers because not only do you get the free beneficial effects, but because when you activate them, the cards go into the cemetery, it also helps increase your Shadow Paladin count in your cemetery. We got one more archetype to go over, and that's the Wasteland, which is the newest archetype to come out in set 11, Bullet of Fate. The main follower in this set that the deck revolves around is Ice Shilindrig Gilded Autocrat here, who also has an evolve form. As a quick side note before we get too deep into Wasteland, Ice Shielding Drake is just a good card in general that fits into many different decks in Abysscraft. So if you are making any kind of Abysscraft deck, do yourself a favor and think for a second if Ice Shielding Drake would be relevant to your deck, and you might want to pick up a playset of the cards relevant to them. I've gone over Icy a lot, but I'm going to go over them just real quick. I'll just try to have it be like a summary explanation. So he's a 5-cost 5/5 that on Fanfare, if you don't have the Magitrain token on your field, you can summon it, and I'll show you the Magitrain token on the next slide. And his other effect is whenever he becomes engaged, each opponent discards a card, and you evolve him for 1 and he turns into a 6/6. On evolve, you can discard a card and select 2 followers in your cemetery and add them back to hand. He still retains the ability to have it where your opponent discards a card whenever he becomes engaged, but he also gains an additional ability that during your turn, whenever a player discards a card, you can select an enemy follower on the field and engage it. This does apply for both when you and your opponent discard a card during your turn, so this can happen twice when you evolve Ice Shielding Drake. Once when you evolve him when you discard a card to grab back 2 followers, and then again when he gets engaged and your opponent has to discard a card, and then you can engage another follower on the field. So in total, you can engage up to 2 followers when you play Icy on his turn. And if you're new to not knowing what Ice Shielding Drake does, we'll move on to the next slide to show what the Magitrain does, because that explains why you want to engage 2 followers. So the Magitrain's in the upper left, and it's a 5-cost 4/5 amulet. The cost doesn't matter, but it does have an ability where you can pay 1 play point and rest any number of followers that cost a total of 5 or more on your field to maneuver it, and when it becomes maneuvered for the turn, it becomes a follower with the 4/5 stats. It has rush, so that allows you to have the train run into a engaged follower, which you would have already engaged an enemy follower with one of Ice Shielding Drake's effects. And then the strike effect says you can destroy an enemy follower on the field that's engaged, and if you do, you give your leader 2 defense. So then that lets you destroy the other follower that you would have engaged with Icy. The card below the Magitrain, Dead to Rights, is a spell that is relevant with Icy and the Magitrain. It's a 1-cost spell that has quick. You can select an enemy follower on the field and give it -2/-2. And if you have a copy of Dead to Rights and Ice Shielding Drake Gilded Autocrat in your cemetery, you can banish both cards for no play points to engage an enemy follower on the field. The idea is every subsequent turn after the first turn you play the Magitrain. The Magitrain can attack the enemy directly for 4, and then with its on-strike effect, destroy a engaged enemy follower. So by sacrificing Dead to Rights and Icy in the cemetery to the banish and engage an enemy follower, you get to have the Magitrain deal 4 to the enemy leader with the attack, and then on strike pop the engaged enemy follower and heal 2. The other kind of small engine in the deck is Il'gyno Horror Stray with Great Pit Corpse and Wretch. Il'gyno essentially never dies. She's a 1-cost 1/1 that when she's sent to the cemetery, you put her into your EX area and you just mill the top card of your deck. When you have Necrocharge 10 and you Fanfare summon her, you can banish her from the field, which stops the loop of her infinitely coming back, but you get to summon a 3-cost Wasteland follower from your cemetery, with the ideal choice being the Wretch, which is a 3-cost 3/2 that can be evolved when summoned back from the cemetery. And I don't have the copy of the Evo form on the screen, but the on-evolve lets you deal 5 damage to an enemy follower, and the Wretch gets Storm instead of Rush, and it still retains the last words of summoning a Bullet Bike token and milling the top 2 cards of your deck. But the idea is it's meant to be kind of a finisher with 4 or 3 stats. Great Pit Corpse is also a card that can be resurrected back with Il'gyno Horror Stray. However, the idea with Great Pit Corpse is you want to have Il'gyno on the field and you play Great Pit Corpse and you get to bury Il'gyno with Great Pit Corpse's Fanfare effect to deal 4 damage to an enemy follower, and then Il'gyno just goes back to your EX area and you mill a card. Skeleton Dreamer is another Wasteland that you can res back with Il'gyno, but it's also not the greatest option. The greatest option is the Wretch, but it is a optional choice if you are having a hard time finding the Wretch. And Skeleton Dreamer can also get Storm if its attack or defense gets buffed at all during your turn. So the Bullet Bike or Dutiful Steed or Arcane Personnel Carrier, although that isn't used at all in this deck, any of those 3 tokens can buff Skeleton Dreamer's stats, which instantly gives it Storm, so it can just attack the opponent directly. Vagabond Lizard is another good card that can help you generate Bullet Bike and Dutiful Steed tokens for future use, either with Great Pit Corpse or Skeleton Dreamer. Dreamer. The Wandering Chef is used mainly for consistency, because on Evolve you can look at the top 4 cards of your deck and grab a Wasteland card, which is perfect for trying to find Icy or Ilgano or any of the other Wasteland cards. And to finish it off is Goldmine Necromancer, which it's a 5 cost, so you can pay 1 and engage it to maneuver the Magic Train, but also its fanfare is pretty good later in the game, where if you have Necrocharge 10, you can deal 4 damage to an enemy follower and then resurrect a 3 cost or less Wasteland follower back from your cemetery, which is just another way to get the Wretch back. There are also a bunch of other non-Wasteland specific cards, but just for the sake of time and just trying to give you the flavor and feel of the deck, these are kind of like the good cards for the deck. Goldmine Necromancer sometimes used, sometimes isn't, but generally speaking, everything else in the Wasteland deck is used in some way, shape, or form. The reason why Goldmine Necromancer isn't used all the time is because there's a lot of other good generic 5-cost Abysscraft followers that are used, and even non-Abysscraft followers like Zelganea of the World that just really fit well with the Magic Train in such a way that Goldmine Necromancer, while designed for the Magic Train, just tends to get outclassed by other cards. And there you have it. That is a pretty good overview of every general archetype in the game. So if you have any questions or anything, feel free to leave them in the comments. I hope it kind of gives you at least a little bit more insight to maybe kind of decks or play styles that you like or art styles you might like. So if you have any questions, again, just feel free to ask. Bye.